April 2nd, 1865. A man sits alone in a burning city, watching everything he fought for turn to ash. Robert E. Lee, the legendary general who had humiliated Union armies for 3 years, now faced a choice that would haunt military strategists for generations. He could surrender and preserve 40,000 lives, or he could gamble one last time, knowing the odds were mathematically impossible. He chose the gamble. And what happened next reveals something dark about human nature, something we still can't escape today. Picture this. Spring 1865. The Confederacy isn't a country anymore. It's a ghost. Fort Fisher has fallen. The ports are sealed. Sherman's army has burned a path of destruction from Georgia to the Carolinas, leaving nothing but smoke and memory. And in Petersburg, Virginia, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia is dissolving. Not from battle, from despair. Every night, 100 men desert. They slip through the trenches in the dark, surrendering to Union lines where there's food, warmth, and an end to the nightmare. Union soldiers run betting pools on how many will flee each night. But Lee? Lee still believes victory is possible. Nietzsche once wrote, "Hope is the worst of evils, for it prolongs the torments of man." Lee's hope was about to prove him right. Robert E. Lee was not a cruel man. He was a Virginian aristocrat, raised on honor, duty, and the illusion that some wars are noble. His soldiers worshipped him. They called him Mas Robert, a father figure who had led them through impossible victories at Chancellorsville, Fredericksburg, and Second Bull Run. But by April 1865, Lee was leading ghosts. His men were starving. Horses collapsed pulling empty wagons. Desertion wasn't cowardice anymore, it was survival. And yet, Lee refused to see reality. Joseph Johnston, another Confederate general, had proposed a plan. Link up, combine their armies, defeat Sherman in North Carolina, then turn back and face Grant. It was a fantasy. But Lee clung to it like a drowning man clutches driftwood. Machiavelli warned, "The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him." Lee's staff? They were exhausted, beaten, and too loyal to tell him the truth. So on April 2nd, when Grant finally broke through at Petersburg, Lee made his decision. He would evacuate Richmond, march west, escape Grant's encirclement, and somehow, win a war that was already over. What followed was not a strategic retreat, it was a death march. Lee's plan was simple. March his 40,000 men to Amelia courthouse, 40 miles west. Food supplies would be waiting. Then, slip past Grant's army, link with Johnston, and fight another day. But when they arrived on April 4th, no food. The supplies had been accidentally sent to the wrong city. Imagine it. You're a Confederate soldier. You haven't eaten in days. You've marched through mud and rain, abandoning cannons and wagons because the horses are too weak to pull them. And now? Nothing. Lee ordered his men to forage, to scatter into the countryside and search for food. That delay? It was fatal, because Philip Sheridan's cavalry was already closing in, and behind him, 3 full Union corps were marching double time. On April 6th at Sailor's Creek, the rearguard collapsed. 7,700 Confederates were captured or killed. Lee watched from a ridge as his army disintegrated. He muttered to an aide, "My God, has the army dissolved?" The Stoics believed that wisdom comes from accepting what you cannot control. But Lee couldn't accept it. He kept marching. April 8th, 1865. Lee's army, now barely 28,000 men, staggered toward Appomattox station. If they could reach Lynchburg, maybe they could regroup. But George Custer's cavalry got there first. They seized the supply train, destroyed the rations, blocked the road. Sheridan's cavalry surrounded them from the south. 3 Union infantry corps closed in from the east. Lee was trapped. That night, Lee sat in his tent and wrote a letter to Ulysses S. Grant. He didn't surrender, not yet, but he asked, "What are your terms?" At dawn on April 9th, Lee ordered one final attack. His men charged the Union cavalry on the ridges outside Appomattox courthouse. For a moment it looked like they might break through. Then they crested the hill and saw 3 full Union corps, 60,000 men, waiting in perfect battle lines. The fight went out of them. Lee's officers begged him to surrender, and finally, he agreed. So what really happened at Appomattox? On the surface, it's simple. Lee ran out of options. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and out of supplies. But the deeper truth: Lee didn't lose at Appomattox. He lost months earlier, when he refused to accept reality. This is what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the inability to reconcile belief with evidence. Lee believed the Confederacy could win. He believed his men were invincible. He believed that honor and elan could overcome logistics and math. But wars aren't won by belief, they're won by resources. Grant had more men, more food, more railroads, more everything. And yet Lee gambled anyway. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." But sometimes, the obstacle is the reality, and denying it doesn't make you brave, it makes you dangerous. Because Lee's pride didn't just cost him the war. It cost 7,700 men at Sailor's Creek. It cost hundreds more in the final, pointless charge at Appomattox. It cost lives that could have been saved if he'd surrendered in February. At 3 p.m. on April 9, 1865, Lee rode to Wilmer McLean's house. He wore his finest dress uniform. His sword was polished. Grant arrived covered in mud, wearing a private's jacket. The war began in McLean's front yard at Bull Run 4 years earlier. It ended in his parlor that afternoon. Here's the part history doesn't talk about enough. After Lee surrendered, his men wept. Not because they lost, but because it was finally over. One soldier wrote, "I felt relief, not shame. We'd been dying for a cause that was already dead." But Lee never quite admitted defeat. For the rest of his life, he framed Appomattox as inevitable, as if he'd been a tragic hero fighting impossible odds, not a general who prolonged a war to protect slavery. This became the lost cause myth, the lie that the Confederacy was noble, that the war was about states' rights, that brave men fought honorably for a doomed cause. It's seductive, it's poetic, and it's a lie. The Confederacy didn't lose because of bad luck. It lost because it was fighting to preserve slavery. And when you build a nation on cruelty, collapse is inevitable. But here's the psychological trap. When you invest everything, your identity, your honor, your life, into a losing cause, admitting defeat feels like admitting you were wrong. And for people like Lee, that's unbearable. So instead, they rewrite the story. Nietzsche again. Sometimes people don't want to hear the truth because they don't want their illusions destroyed. Lee never destroyed his illusions, and neither, it seems, have we. So here's the uncomfortable question. When are you Lee? When have you held on to a belief, a relationship, a career, a political view, long past the point where the evidence screamed, "Let go"? When have you sacrificed something real, your time, your money, someone else's well-being, because admitting failure felt worse than prolonging the fight? We see it everywhere. The gambler who loses everything because one more hand will fix it. The CEO who bankrupts a company rather than admit their strategy failed. The leader who wages war rather than negotiate peace. At Appomattox, Lee finally faced the truth. But it came too late. 7,700 men died at Sailor's Creek because he couldn't let go. Hundreds more died in the final, pointless charge because pride demanded one last stand. History remembers Lee as a tragic figure. But the men who died in those final weeks, they weren't tragic. They were sacrificed. On April 9, 1865, at 4 p.m., Robert E. Lee signed the surrender. Grant's terms were generous. No executions, no imprisonment, just go home. Lee's soldiers were allowed to keep their horses for spring planting, Officers kept their sidearms. Grant even ordered rations distributed to the starving Confederates. One Union soldier later wrote, "There was no cheering, no celebration. We'd all lost too much. The war began because men couldn't let go of power. It ended when one man finally could. But the lesson? It's not about Lee, it's about the moment before you become him. The Stoics teach, amor fati, love your fate, accept what is. But we don't. We cling, we fight, we gamble. And sometimes that courage is heroic, but sometimes it's just pride wearing a uniform. So the next time you hear someone say, "I'll never surrender," ask yourself, are they fighting for something worth saving? Or are they just too afraid to let go?